Welcome back to Midas Touch Legal AF with Court Accountability Action. My name is Alex Aronson, and it is great to be back with you here where we try to make sense of the madness in this fast-moving and incredibly chaotic period of history that we are living through. As I've been reflecting on this challenge of how to really make sense of what is going on day to day in this country, in this world, one thing I've been really thinking about is the extent to which we are, in many ways, living in separate realities. We talk about how we are divided, we have partisan polarization, but in many respects, I think that's wrong. Like, Americans are united by core shared values, and we have been driven to division by a political apparatus that has incentives to divide us, an authoritarian movement that is reaching its climax in this moment. And we've seen the ways in which authoritarians have used these different truths, these alternative facts, to distort our world, to change laws, change policy, change the Constitution. One area where this dynamic has, I think, been particularly alarming is in the emergence of pseudoscience in the health domain, the emergence of the MAHA movement and Robert F. Kennedy's positioning and appointment as the director of the Health and Human Services Secretary. And we saw this week exactly what that looked like with the gross demonstration of pseudoscience and distorted facts and disinformation that he laid out in that congressional hearing this week. I'm so thrilled this week to dig into this incredibly important dynamic and this disjointed reality and the challenges it presents for truth and democracy with a leading voice calling out what is happening in the pseudoscience movement, in the MAHA movement. Dr. Jessica Nurick is a PhD in dietary sciences and has taken to social media platforms. Over 2 million followers across these platforms are learning from Dr. Nurick about what actually is happening with our health and science, about how these authoritarian apparatuses, about how these corporate special interests are leveraging the breakdown in our system to divide us and to sow chaos. Dr. Nurick, thank you so much for joining us here at Court Accountability with Legal AF. Friends, while we have you here, please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Excited to dig into this with you. It's just incredible what you're doing to bring this stuff to public light. How did you sort of get compelled to do this from your background? What were you seeing that made you take to the kind of a public-facing, public educator role?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I came to social media when I was pregnant with my daughter in 2022, and I was really seeing a big difference between when I had my son in 2019 and my daughter in 2022 at the amount of misinformation that I was being targeted with via the algorithms. And then I saw it particularly in the pregnancy space just because I was pregnant at that time, and I saw a lot of misinformation about pregnancy nutrition. And so that was really brought me to social media. I was like, let me correct some of this, because I felt a kind of an obligation. And, I was going through anxiety, and then I had really bad postpartum anxiety with my daughter. And so I felt like I wanted to be protective of other women, who had young children as well, who were being targeted with a lot of this misinformation. And so that's what brought me to social media. That's the domain I was kind of operating in while, I was pregnant postpartum as well. And then last summer is when, I really started, and I would do some like just basic nutrition kind of videos as well for the general population. But last summer is when I really saw this MAHA movement kind of come to light when RFK Jr. decided to partner with Trump and create this particular movement. And I think because it was just my exact area of expertise, I've studied chronic disease prevention. That was really my focus in my studies. And then also how policy impacts the kind of factors of health that go into the health of people and how we can prevent chronic disease. I was able to really see how manipulative a lot of the narratives were. And yeah. I just kind of felt I didn't see anyone calling it out. I saw a lot of traction with like wellness influencers online, like promoting the movement. But I didn't see anyone kind of talking about how manipulative and misleading it was. And so that's when I started doing that online.
I'm so curious to hear about what you've learned about this social media ecosystem of the MAHA movement as you've started to engage with it to sort of counter it. as you describe it, you were exposed to it almost organically as these algorithms. They probably figured out you were pregnant, started feeding you this type of content. A lot of people, I think, are probably in your position, being exposed to this type of content. It probably seems organic. They might, hear from authentic seeming voices that seem very trustworthy. They might well be good faith, organic voices that believe this stuff. But as you've started to dive into this and expose it, what have you learned about where these ideas are coming from? Are they organic? People are picking them up and carrying them, but where are they really coming from?
Well, I think what's interesting is that if you actually look at what people within the Maha movement want, like the people, who are really just part of the movement, not the leaders at the top, but part of the movement, much of what they want is exactly what I want, right? So there's so much alignment between, the quote unquote sides, right? What public health experts and scientists are working towards is very much what most of the people in the Maha movement also want. That's why I say that the narrative has really been manipulated to make it seem like it's an us versus them, when really we all want the same thing. And the manipulation comes into play, with how do you get there, right? And then what are the causes, and then how do you come up with the solutions? And so I think that's what's been very striking to me. What's really been a factor here is Maha really took a page out of the wellness influencer playbook. So a lot of my colleagues in the science communication space have been debunking some of these same people who are really high up in the Maha movement for almost a decade, right? People who are fear-mongering particular ingredients. And they saw how these types of things would play really well on social media. This conspiratorial, fear-based information, particularly targeted at a demographic like young moms, for example, that just want to do what's best for their children and that don't, obviously and they're in a space and a time in their life where they're consuming information, right? When you're pregnant, when you're a new mom, you're consuming information and you really want to learn all you can at a time. Maybe there's no other time in life like it, to be honest with you.
I'm thinking back to my sleepless nights and how impressionable I was, and I would have taken anybody's advice.
Of course. Yeah. And so I think, they took a page right out of the playbook and they kind of adopted a lot of these talking points and the playbook of these people who, again, have been spreading misinformation online for a very long time. And so I think that's been very interesting to watch and witness.
And maybe we could drill into the RFK hearing a little bit, because we can also see some of the other upshots of this strategy, right? It's not just to divide us, right? We've got this, and you've broken this down. I'd love to maybe insert a clip of one of your recent Instagram posts, because I think you broke it down so well. Somebody I think was mentioning you in a video through a supermarket, and you sort of just gave some really important history and context about how sort of corporate anti-regulatory interests had created this system that has effectively made Americans unhealthy.
Why is it like this in the USA? You don't have mega-sized cereal for mega-sized people? Large corporations don't own the entire shelf? You're telling me that's high fructose corn syrup?
I got tagged a bunch in this video and he didn't really answer the question. He just showed you a bunch of ingredients and ultra-processed foods and then told you about his wellness tests and products at the end. So I'll answer it. Why is America like this? In America, we have a capitalist economy that's driven by pro-corporation deregulatory policies. Policies that have enabled corporations to prioritize profits and growth above all other values, including people's health. Our current food environment, which is about 70% ultra-processed foods by some estimates, is not because of some conspiracy. It's the logical conclusion of policies that enable corporate expansion with little regulation. So how did we get here? In the early 1980s, under the Reagan administration, agriculture and food policy shifted dramatically toward deregulation and pro-industry approaches. Pro-corporation policies during this time also favored large agribusiness at the expense of small family-owned farms, which exacerbated the farm crisis of the 1980s and led to the consolidation of the food environment. As a result, there was a loss of local food systems and a greater reliance on industrialized food production that could travel far, which really fueled the dominance of these prepackaged ultra-processed foods. Now, at the same time, the shareholder value movement was gaining momentum, which reinforced the idea that the primary responsibility of corporations was to maximize shareholder returns. For food companies, this meant that they not only had to sell food in an increasingly competitive environment where there was already too much food per person, but they also had to show growth and report that growth to Wall Street every 90 days. How do you do that? How do you continue to show profits and growth in a food environment where there's already too many calories per person available? Well, you cut costs by using the cheapest ingredients possible. You diversify the number of food products that you have, especially those that are hyperpalatable with a lot of salt, sugar, and fat, and low in other nutrients like fiber and other micronutrients. You lobby politicians to support deregulation efforts so that you can easily market to children and low-income populations without a lot of barriers. You lobby for subsidies to keep the cost of crops in your foods low. You lobby for lax antitrust laws to enable mergers and acquisitions so that very few corporations own the majority of our food supply. And ultimately, after a few decades of this, where profit and growth are what's most important to corporations and politicians who need money from those corporations enable those corporations, you're left with a food environment that prioritizes profits above all else, including people's health.
And now we've got a different narrative that's being driven to assign different blame for that. And a very angry and agitated movement of people that have made this a huge political priority in their lives, because as you note, it's been connected to things that really matter to them, right? Their kids and their what their kids are eating and things like that. So it's pretty tricky to figure out how to do this. And I wonder, I guess, to actually ask a question is, how are you finding the experience of countering this type of misinformation? Are you finding openings to change minds, to have conversations? Because I agree with you. People want the same stuff.
Yeah, I think yes and no. I think there will always be people who are not willing to listen to me, just because of the nature of the environment that we're living in right now that is so divided. But where I do find a lot of success and luck is just being honest. Like I genuinely want what many people, again, in the MAHA movement want, and so I tend to lead with that in a lot of like my content is just if we want whatever it is, reduce toxins in the environment. Here's what actually has to happen in order for us to have reduced toxins in the environment. If we want a better food supply, we need a lot more than just swapping a color additive in candy or a low nutrient ultra processed food. We need a lot more than swapping a sugar source with a pretty equivalent sugar source in Coca-Cola. We need more than those things. We need more than swapping the fat source in French fries at a fast food restaurant. Like those are very superficial swaps. And if I make a list of 20 things that we could do to improve the food environment, those would be on the very bottom, right? But we're putting all of our energy into those things, and it's distracting us from all of the things that could actually help us to improve something like the food environment. And we're seeing that in pretty much every arena in health, looking at healthcare and food accessibility and education and all of these different areas, housing. It's really a distraction from all of the determinants that actually go into our health, because what a lot of the MAHA movement gets right is really like the problem, right? We do have a chronic disease issue in this country, particularly a lifestyle related chronic disease issue. We do have a food environment that's really set up for us to fail. By some estimates, it's 70% ultra processed food, right? So we do have these truths do exist. And it's figuring out like, how could we actually come together to make real change instead of kind of being, what is it called? Like, our focus is on something else. Distracted is the word I'm looking for. We're distracted by, something that's not actually going to move the needle on health.
Yeah, and very much by design, right? And if we could kind of lock arms and figure that out together, it feels like we could make some real strides here. But I don't know. It feels to me that this one, particularly with, just how, like, as we've been discussing, this is really personal stuff. And these decisions, these reckless decisions that we're seeing RFK and the Trump administration make right now, I think the consequences, the negative consequences will be felt. And so we'll see what happens. I think, people are going to rise up and protect their families at the end of the day.
Yeah, and we should maybe mention why they're focusing so much on these like additives, food additives, right? And making these like superficial swaps, or asking industry to make these swaps. They're not actually regulating any of these things. They're just asking industry, will you make these swaps, and like calling them MAHA wins, when again, there's no evidence to suggest that's going to do anything to improve our food supply or the health of Americans. But they're really focusing in on those things. One, because again, it's the wellness influencer playbook that did really well on social media. But more than that, much more than that, it's to erode trust in scientists and public health institutions, which, if you say that we're poisoning Americans with these toxins in the food, that's because scientists are saying they're okay, because scientists are all paid off, and then medical doctors are all paid off to prescribe medications. And so you lose trust in all of these experts when they're not. I mean, if you've ever met a scientist, they're not like rolling in money, trust me. But where the real issue is, right, is in the policies that have been enacted. So our politicians who are enacting policies that are designing these systems for profit at the expense of our health, right? And so a scientist, we can go through the science and we can say what's best and we can give advice, but scientists aren't dictating policy. And our public health institutions often aren't dictating policy, like the CDC, RFK Jr. in that hearing blamed the CDC for the chronic disease epidemic, which is just not in line with reality. But he does it to erode trust in the CDC so that he can justify gutting the CDC and removing, career scientists, because he's been on this kick for the last 2 decades of calling the CDC corrupt because of, their advice on vaccination.
Gosh, heady stuff, heavy stuff. Dr. Jessica Nurick, thank you so much for what you're doing. You're really an inspiration. I think a lot of times when we have these conversations with experts, with movement leaders, folks who have been steeped in various arenas at the intersection of law and politics, it's really inspiring. And we have a community of folks here that are looking for ways to do their part in fighting fascism, in building a better democracy. And you're such a great example. I was out last night and met somebody who was feeling really overwhelmed, really scared, didn't know how he could fit in. And like all of us have something we can do. We all have skills. We all have a knowledge base. And that you took yours in what, on its face doesn't seem like a political thing. And ultimately, at the end of the day, your content, your public education that you're doing, it's not really political. But that's what's happened, right? Is our whole lives have been enmeshed in this stuff, and so let's tap into our resources, into our own skill sets, into our networks, and find motivation from Dr. Nurick. Thank you so much for your time, for your work, folks. Hit that like and subscribe button. Don't forget, stay mad, stay motivated, stay mighty. See you next time.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.